Day 968. All right, folks. So today is the conclusion or part 3 of my ongoing series titled Lifting Rules I Routinely Break. Now, before we move on, I want to be clear. The purpose of this series is not to be anti-evidence. Far from it. In fact, I'm extremely evidence-based. The entire purpose of the series is just to demonstrate that 100% by the book, according to the research, isn't the only way to be successful in your training. I mean, what's sport specific in one instance might be completely absurd and nonsensical in another. Studies and evidence are probably the best tool that exists for getting you on paper, for figuring out what the averages are, for learning the reference ranges of things. However, to really tighten your shot group, to really zero in on those specific to your N of 1 robust training effects, you got to play around with the various pieces of evidence that seem to be doing something and then play with them for a meaningful period of time. We always talk about progressive resistance and volume and overload and all these kinds of things, but really the two most important training variables are number one going to be specificity, not just sport specificity, but individual specificity, and then consistency, the repeated bout effect. In the history of sport and strength and conditioning, a lot of this stuff was figured out by trial and error first, and then later science established mechanism of action. So always keep that in mind. So with all that said, let's wrap up this top 10 list of rules that I routinely break with the pump. Do I value or train for the pump? I mean, if I get a pump, it's cool, but do I train specifically for a pump or do things like occlusion, Katsu training, or things like this? Not really. What I am a big fan of is what Renaissance periodization refers to as perturbation, which typically I only get with a sufficiently stimulative load. So I use the example like this. Say you get like a pen or a pencil, just a typical writing utensil, right? And you do thousands of curls with it all day. Well, you're not going to get 21-inch biceps doing that because the weight of that pencil is well beneath the minimum stimulatory load required to provide any kind of impetus for growth in your bicep. Similarly, if you look at, for instance, marathon runners or triathletes, they don't have massive quads and glutes and hamstrings, even though technically the stimulus of all their quad, glute, and hamstring activity for the many tens of thousands of steps that they execute in a marathon, there isn't enough force production in any of those steps to meet the minimum stimulus threshold in order to trigger growth in those muscle groups. That's why, for instance, you see velodrome cyclists or Olympic sprinters with jacked quads, glutes, and hamstrings because they put out a lot of force but in a very short amount of time and not for nearly as long, nearly as many repetitions as a marathon runner or a triathlete do, because it's impossible. You can't generate that much force for that period of time unless you're like Captain America or something. So all that to say, it's one of the reasons why certain muscle groups, certain activities, in order to get that perturbation, I just have to lift heavy enough to make it happen automatically. If I just do a pressing routine with pure calisthenics, like just push-ups, it's not enough raw stimulus magnitude. It's not loaded enough that I really get that deep sense of perturbation. I might get a decent pump, but it's nowhere near what I get doing 5 sets of triples with the 80s on incline dumbbell press, for instance. So all that to say, do I chase the pump? No. Do I chase perturbation via loading? 100%. So that dovetails nicely into the other rule that I don't really break this one, but I go about it a little bit differently. Progressive overload. So a lot of newer lifters think every time you go into the gym, you should try to add 5 pounds or at least a 2.5. I don't really do that. Number one, I'm just not a very large person. I'm of East African descent. I'm more endurance coded. So being like world's strongest man or a world record powerlifter was never in the cards for me. And whenever I've tried to progress too quickly, it has been at the expense of my connective tissues because, as you know, connective tissues take a significantly longer period of time to inure themselves to heavier loads than muscle tissue does. Progression typically goes in this order. First, nerves. So you train your brain to send a stronger signal to the muscle to contract harder, to activate more motor units. Then next, the muscle actually gets stronger and or bigger, more cross-sectional area, more organelles inside the structure of the muscle, better utilization of energy, these kinds of things. And then last, the connective tissue, the ligaments and the tendons, and even the bone structure between the joints, or rather relative to each side of the joint, I should say, increases to the point where now these new heavier loads are more sustainable. So what I do, which I've made videos on in the past on my channel, is I do double or triple progressions, which is that, say for instance right now I'm doing triples with the 80s on incline dumbbell. I will stay on the 80s until I'm comfortably getting sets of 7. And then I'll move up to 85 or 90, which will put me right at doubles or triples of that weight. So I stay with a weight until I own it for a meaningful amount of repetitions, and then I progress. Because that period of several months typically gives even my connective tissues enough time to adapt to the new loading parameters. All right, so now that we've covered my take on progressive overload, next is going to be failure training. Now, like many lifters my age, I too was once a younger person and a newer lifter and fell in love with the concept of training to failure. There were two reasons for this. Number one, at that time in my life, all I had to worry about was school and training. And number two, I was a lot younger, and so I recovered much faster and more completely from just about anything I subjected myself to. Now, with pretty good for my age, but still not optimal recovery, and a family and travel and a career and all the other things going on in my life, I can't just leave it all in the gym every day, eat, sleep for 3-4 hours, go to class for an hour, and then rinse, repeat. That isn't my life anymore. So while I do believe in training to a certain proximity to failure, you don't just want to phone in your efforts. And that's a whole nother video that I plan on doing in the near future on how a lot of people just don't see results because they simply don't train hard enough. Like I've said a million times on this channel, we can do better than just move around and burn calories. We want to train for a purpose. I don't necessarily want to take everything to failure on every set and just be completely wasted from training. So how do I implement the concept of failure training? Big major movements, usually my primary movement, I'll stay at worst 2 to 3 RAR reps in reserve, at best 0 to 1 RAR on maybe like the last 2 sets. And then smaller single joint movements like lateral raises, curls, things like that, yeah, we can take those to failure because those aren't going to generate a ton of fatigue moving forward. And then the last thing, volume. I'm a big volume guy, but not volume like ad infinitum. This last thing is almost entirely anecdote and personal preference, but I just like doing exercises in sets of 5. I like having an established past halfway point, and just over the years, it seems like usually the first 1 or 2 sets are like getting switched on, and then I have 3 or 4 solid working sets. So is that really not following a rule? I don't know. That's up to you to decide. So that's it, folks. Rules that I routinely break, top 10. I'm going to put all these in a playlist that you can find on my channel. Like, subscribe, join the Discord, leave a comment down below, and thanks for watching.